when it comes to, resources, whatever that means, the resource is education. And then I don't know how you get into experience without, unfortunately, people going missing. But I think you know what I'm saying here is that the best resource, I'd rather have 10 investigators on the job who are really, really knowledgeable about this. You brought up 17. I'd rather have 17 people officers on a reservation that know all about disappearances than 50 who do not.
That's Ed Dentzel, the host of the Unfound podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Ed Dentzel has command of a unique subject. He's developed a deep knowledge of and a skill in understanding long-term disappearances. If you've listened to our previous 2 episodes together, you'll know that Ed is a bit of a Renaissance man. He grew up in rural Pennsylvania, trained as a classical pianist, played baseball, was an actor for more than 4 years on Star Trek: The Experience in Las Vegas, and a field consultant for 7-Eleven, as well as a novel writer, a filmmaker, and a stage manager for shows. Somewhere along the way, Ed started searching the web for information about disappearances. I have a theory about his interest in the topic, but it's hard to ultimately say. It blossomed into more than 300 episodes of a podcast and a YouTube channel that includes live episodes, what I'd call geographic profiling regarding cases, a Patreon site that includes written analysis of cases. Ed also took the witness stand in the murder trial of Steve Pinsky. Steve had been accused of the murder of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews, a Greeley, Colorado girl who disappeared in 1984 and whose murder was discussed by President Ronald Reagan, and she became one of the first milk carton kids. Those were from the days where names, pictures, and dates of disappearances of children were printed on the side of milk cartons as a part of a nationwide effort to find missing children. Along the way, Ed has developed a repository of data about long-term disappearances, and that insight is of great value to help law enforcement and families, particularly when it comes to signs of short-term disappearances that may turn into long-term ones. It also tackles some of the misconceptions about those who go missing. We've covered many missing and murdered Indigenous persons cases, from Nada Frank in Minnesota to Emily Risling in Northern California to Ashley Loring Heavy Runner in Montana. Today, Ed and I are going to sit down and talk about his journey, the myths and realities of long-term disappearances, and the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis in a way that we haven't before on this show. So, Ed, I wanted to thank you for coming back on again. I really enjoyed having you on the first time. And, those 2 episodes, I think listeners really enjoyed hearing your perspective, but also finding out a little bit about you and what motivates you. So I wanted to start the conversation, talking a little bit about your background, how you developed your interest in sort of crime and disappearances, how, Unfound came about. And, one of the things about Unfound too, that's really interesting, I've seen you, do your YouTube channel. I've listened to the podcast. I've read the notes on your Patreon. I've watched you do the map analysis and interview people, and a lot of very different skills all come together.
Yes, you have to be certainly a jack of all trades, at least the way I do it. Sure. That's right.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up interested in disappearances. I have my theory.
Well, you can voice your theory after I tell you the truth.
Go ahead.
Really just got started. I grew up in the hills of Pennsylvania. I did not grow up in a big city or anything. And so, as even before I was 10 years old, my window into what was the world was a show called In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, that would come on. I don't know if it was like new episodes, maybe they might have been reruns or something, but they were on Saturday afternoons, like right then, like after the cartoons, Saturday morning cartoons. And I can remember like the old Godzilla movies would be on in the afternoons in the 1970s. And then In Search Of was in there somewhere. And as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it just fascinated me because I'm like, man, there's this whole world out there. I have this little yard in Gilpin Township, but man, there is so much stuff going on out there. That is amazing. Because they covered like a lot of real stuff, but you look back at it, they kind of came up with a lot of contrived stuff too. You know, UFOs and aliens built on the pyramids and things like that. But that was my first entry into mysteries. There is a world out there where things have happened and people don't know how to explain them. Adults don't know how to explain what has happened, even with modern technology. And it just kind of went from there, got into the 80s. I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but my best friends, they're all 3 brothers. Their father was a part-time cop. I'd go over there. I was always fascinated by the scanner that they had in their house, listening to what's going on in the community, even though it was not a lot going on, but it was fascinating. There are police officers out there, and you can hear about cats in trees and fires going on and things like that. That was fascinating to me. The show Cops came out in the late 1980s, and of course, Unsolved Mysteries. It was just kind of, I think going back to the 70s, it was like a little snowball that got started being pushed downhill.
Yeah.
Order, it gets more momentum, bigger. And then combine all of that with my writing background that I developed when I went to Las Vegas and took a screenwriting class and took some other movie making classes, did some movie making, did some acting, did some improv work, worked on productions, TV productions and movie productions, and wrote a ton of screenplays that have never seen the light of day. And then I wrote some novels. All of it eventually culminated in doing the podcast. It was like the technology finally caught up with all of these skills that I had developed. So it was my experience, and then the podcast world or technology, whatever you want to call it, iTunes, Spotify, all of that just all came together in 2016.
Yeah. I think back to growing up for me. Obviously, Saturday mornings start with cartoons, at least for me. But I remember that same feeling as you had, but it wasn't the Saturday TV shows. It was the first time I noticed what was on the back of my milk carton.
Huh.
It really was the first time. And I can almost remember them. And what they looked at. And I didn't really think much of it at the time, but I just thought, that's weird. A child missing. That's weird. Like, I don't know any missing children. And I was I was probably like 7 or 8. But I do remember that moment. And it's kind of interesting how that seed really got planted for you. And the 80s were sort of like a generation where Reagan and other people were talking about missing children a lot.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Regarding kids on milk cartons, I'll be honest, I don't have a real good recollection of that. We certainly drank milk. I'm not much of a cereal eater anymore, but for many decades loved cereal. And so I've drank a lot of milk in my day. As a kid, I don't remember that. I'm sure it existed. I'm sure those milk cartons made their way to Leechburg, Pennsylvania. I just don't remember.
Yeah. And I may totally not have this right, but I think they weren't on the big cartons. I only remember them on like this. It technically was a single serve carton, but it was like bigger than a single serve carton. It was like a tall single carton. Um, like I can even remember sort of like red top, red on the side. But yeah, it didn't take for me like that. But I do remember that kind of like shocking feeling like, wow, that's weird.
Yeah.
I don't know any of these. And then, promptly moving on to my cartoon world. And so, throughout your career, you've done lots of different things, trained as a classical pianist,
True.
acted,
Yes.
Written.
Yep.
It,
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit of a Renaissance man. I've dabbled in a lot of things from sports to the arts. When I worked in part-time, I had a part-time job in Las Vegas working on printers and fax machines. So I'm a little technically inclined as well. It's just a little bit of everything through 55 years now.
you must have a lot of natural curiosity about
I
things.
do. I do. You have to. I think you have to be a good interviewer with anything, whether it's sports or interviewing famous people like Johnny Carson used to do. You actually have to be interested in what they're saying. And you're not just doing it, to fill up time or anything. You really have to listen. And I think that comes from my improv practice that I had at Star Trek and being around actors 25 years ago certainly helps today in interviewing everybody that I do interview.
How is it that acting in your mind helps? Because when I think of acting, I think of the sort of opposite side of it, not the reaction to other people, but or to things. I think of the projection piece of it, but I know it's more complicated than that from having talked to actors.
I was not Al Pacino or somebody like Meryl Streep, but you did have to act in my job at Star Trek. You were required to do that. And it really is about reacting. Even though you do the same script every day, it's still about reacting and listening and seeing the body language and how that person is that day to make it as realistic as possible.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't, you have to match that other person's energy or it's just not going to work.
Yeah. When
Even
people
if
ask,
you know what the other person is going to say.
Right. And I think of that in my own interviewing, being very cautious about sort of like predicting in my head what people are going to say. And when people ask me what helps me most in interviewing, it's not questions. It's really listening intently to what the person is saying,
Yes.
and not really thinking about what I want to say or ask.
That's right. I will tell you that, of course, all the interviews that I do for Unfound are scripted. That doesn't mean I know exactly the words that the person is going to use. But for the most part, when person is talking, I don't have my next question planned, or if I'm even going to say anything at all, until they virtually almost get to the end of that sentence or what they're going to say. That is the way I think proper interviews are done. You really wait. You really, really, really have a good idea of the point that person is trying to make. And then you determine at that point, is this where I move the conversation to something else? Or do I think that something is unclear and I have to ask follow-up questions? You can only do that if you understand what the person is saying and you feel like the conversation is going in the direction that both of you planned for it to go.
Right. And there's another part of it, I think, too, and this definitely stands out in your interviews. Not only are you listening to what people are saying and truly reacting to what they're saying, it doesn't feel like you've predetermined your question, that you're really responsive. But I think for the interviewee, as somebody who's been interviewed before and interviewed on your podcast, And certainly from hearing this from my guests, feeling as if you're truly being listened to breaks down walls, and it stops being an interview and it just starts being a conversation.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's totally. And something everybody needs to understand is this is my perception, that the way I do my interviews is at least a little bit rare, at least in the true crime community, because the conversations that you hear on Unfound are real conversations. This is not something where I spoke to somebody and I just recorded what they said for 2 hours and then I insert my questions into it afterwards. Like, that's the way a lot of people do it, frankly, because it's a lot easier. You can do that. Whereas when you're listening to me talk to a guest, that's happening in real time.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
going back and forth. And granted, some mistakes and things will get edited out, but that's a real conversation you're hearing.
Yeah. Very similar to my approach. The amount that I cut out is usually exactly what you said. Somebody tells me they made a mistake, or it's clear that I did, but I really want people that feel like they're being given access to having a conversation with the
Yeah.
person who's there. So tell me about, one of the things that we talked about last time was the idea that, law enforcement does not, if you're the average cop, in Phoenix or in, a small town in Indiana, you don't run into a lot of long-term disappearances across your career. You might not run into anyone anywhere you're the,
True.
you're responding to it or you're the investigator on it.
True.
And a lot of things in law enforcement, when there's a burglary, when there's a murder, there's like a protocol. That protocol is not like one for one. You always do it like this, but there's a way to like zero in. There's some best practices and there's some common things. And one of the interesting things that I think I became very crystal clear in talking to you is that there is no such thing for long-term disappearances, at
No.
least, in a knowledge base within
Right.
departments. Talk to me about that.
That's right. I mean, certainly there is a protocol for the first couple days. Somebody goes missing and a family member, a friend, or somebody goes in and fills out a report. And even, of course, even that can get convoluted if, that person starts getting stories about, well, you have to wait 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours or something like that, which is all crap. But there's protocol to start and they'll do some things, but I will continue to insist. I've never been a police officer, but after about a week, most police departments, as far as what they can do and what they're about out of ideas.
So the normal things might be, okay, we get a missing persons, we use social media or alerts or whatever it may be. We send out some investigators to talk to people. And, maybe we get to the stage where we're doing like a canvas, looking for the person if we found something or there's some kind of evidence. I was talking to Morgan Dana Harrington's parents recently.
I know that murder. I followed it very closely when it happened.
Yeah.
15 years ago.
Yeah,
Something.
2009.
Yep.
2009. Yeah, they were on this week and last week. The episodes aired. And, one of the things in reading Jill Harrington, her mom's book, that I was sort of taken aback by, and I asked her about this piece. So I'll ask you about it. We were talking about the idea of canvassing and searching for someone. And the state police in Virginia told them, we'll search, but we only search where evidence is. So we first have to find some kind of evidence that suggests. And that really limits your options in a lot of ways.
Of course it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I would say is that the problem we have with disappearance investigations today, there is no what we would call intuition. And that's a perfect example of it. If you're only going to go look where there is evidence, well, you might not ever do any looking or any searching.
Right.
And you know that's wrong. Somebody is missing. Somebody should be doing a search somewhere. And oftentimes there is no arrow pointing in a particular direction. Well, what is going to then help? What is going to help is understanding disappearances and being able to know the history of them, being able to tell, well, this disappearance kind of feels or looks a lot like this disappearance from 17 years ago that eventually got solved. And this girl was found in the woods a couple miles away. And you can start tapping into and showing my age a Rolodex of disappearances that you have in your head that sound similar to this one, even if it's not in your jurisdiction or your county or your state, that you can say, you know what, Morgan's disappearance, because it was a disappearance for a little while, this sounds like that girl who went missing in Wyoming 13 years ago. Maybe we should try that.
Right.
That's the kind of intuition that you need. That's the kind of intuition that they don't have, because they don't have that Rolodex. None of these police officers, they don't have it in their heads. They don't have it on a computer. So every time a Morgan Harrington goes missing, it's like the first time a Morgan Harrington ever went missing.
We're reinventing the wheel.
Whereas everything else we do, I often use the circumstances like building a bridge. You would never hire an engineer to build a bridge who has never built a bridge before. And you'd certainly never hire a person to build a bridge who built one bridge and then didn't learn anything from that. And it was going to start
right.
10. But this is the way we go about disappearances. This is the way the police go about disappearances. Every time they get a report, it's like the first time they've ever gotten a report, because they will say, well, we can't do anything without evidence. Well, something bad happened. You're just going to sit there and do nothing then.
Yeah, there was one great example you gave in the last episode about cars, that if you don't find the person's car, there's some common places to look.
Yes.
And that's kind of one, there's an intuitive thing behind that, right? Like logically, it's kind of hard to make a car disappear.
Yes.
So where do cars disappear? They might disappear if they're in a garage. They might disappear in a chop shop, although that's quite rare. But you know where else? Bodies of water.
Bodies of water.
Yeah.
And what Adventures with Purpose and Chaos Divers, and there are some more local scuba groups here in Florida, what they've exposed is that the police are a bunch of liars, where they said, we've done everything to try to find this woman. These scuba companies and scuba groups, volunteers who are working for free, all they're doing is looking at maps and saying, you know what? Most likely she and her car went in right here. Now, they might not get it the first time. They're going to look at a few different areas. But it's amazing how much of the time that works. You're telling me the police in 1985 or 1993 or 2009 couldn't have done that. But they'll say they did everything. It's just not true, because the scuba companies are proving they didn't do everything.
Right.
As I've told our friend Julia Cowley, because she, within, the last 3 months, covered a disappearance that was unsolved for a while. And then the girl or woman was found in her car. I keep telling Julia, these disappearances with people and their cars are the easiest disappearances to solve. Bar none, the easiest. That doesn't mean they're easy as in Noah Webster definition easy, but they're the easiest to solve, and police still bungle them.
Yeah. And it makes complete sense just on an intuitive level. Like big giant object, easier to find than individual human. Find big giant object, you will find clues that point to where
animals can't drag cars away. If a person walks off into the wood and overdoses, then animals come along. Animals don't drag cars away.
Right. And one of the things that, I wonder about, and thinking about that more, just sort of the broad question. Do any solutions come to mind in terms of like feeding the knowledge bank of officers?
Well, first you'd have to get over the idea that first you have to get past the ego of them. First of all, what has to be penetrated is the human ego of people finding, these people in these positions who do a lot of things well. They show up for domestic violence issues and shootings, and when guns go off, they go running in they have huge egos because of the work they do. And when you start telling them, you know what, you're really, really failing in this part, even though it's true, that's an issue. That is a human pride issue. That is not necessarily a police officer issue. It's a human issue. None of us like to be told, you know what, you're failing here and you should be doing way better in that part. So first you have to get through that.
Yeah. My message to them is that failure is survivable.
Yeah. I guess being that to my knowledge, the way I see it, being that we have 100,000 missing, unsolved disappearances in the United States, and there is not one class in any criminal justice school in the United States, tells me something.
Wow.
That tells me something. It tells me that both professors, and I love Dr. Grace Telesco, very, very close friend of mine at Nova Southeastern University. But
criminologists,
1,000 unsolved disappearances in the United States, and nobody's teaching anything about them. We have to start wondering what's going on.
Yeah. It almost makes you feel like it's avoidance, right? Or it's something, right? It's some kind of.
It's certainly something. Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of stigma that goes along with that, because there's a perception, well, all of these people were maybe into drugs and in all these things that mental health issues and everything. And so there's not a lot of sympathy for them. You listen to my podcast, about 100 episodes, you'll find out there's a lot of people who go missing that don't have any of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
And were certainly murdered. And certainly there are killers walking around. I guess law enforcement is comfortable with that.
Yeah. Well, that's alarming, but a good transition. One of the things that I've really taken a strong interest in has been the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people. And I almost hate to frame it that way, because to call it the crisis of, I think, makes people think that this is a relatively new thing. But it's really been going on for a long time. And I was telling someone recently, Ed, they were asking me, why has this become such a passion for you? And as someone who's a Black American, I think of it kind of like this. It would be really hard for America to write slavery out of history. It's kind of like our original sin, kind of key to lots of different things. But I feel like for Natives, a lot of what we've done is erasure. And I think it grates me that these cases don't get as much attention. So I want to do my part, right? My little part may mean nothing, but I want to do my part. But in my work, in looking into them, and even traveling, I've traveled to Minnesota, I've traveled to Montana, related to specific situations. The volume of disappearances and the disappearances per capita really, really take me back. When I went out to Montana, I went to Missoula, and there was an Irish artist who was there, and he had painted portraits of people who had gone missing, Indigenous people who had gone missing and had gone murdered. And I'm going through and I'm seeing some familiar faces. Leo Wagner was one, Jermaine Charlo, Ashley Loring, Heavy Runner. And then I came across this one family, 3 siblings. One was shot by the police. One was murdered on a highway. One went missing. And then I was talking to the artist afterwards, and he's like, oh, yeah, there's not a fourth portrait about the fourth child who killed herself after all of these things happen. And to think you know, one family going through all those. And I had this guest recently, Haley Omiso, who's from the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. She's gone into forensic anthropology. She started a firm focused on forensics. But she was telling me, Haley's only 27, and she told me that, since graduating from high school, so we're talking about a decade or a little under a decade, 10 of her classmates from high school have been murdered or gone missing.
Yeah.
That frightens me to think of,
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you think about the broader problem of sort of long-term disappearances among Indigenous people. Are there, things about it that are unique or core, or is it just sort of like an outgrowth of some of the other things that you see? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, everybody should know I am not Native American. I'm a white guy. So I want to make sure that we put this in the proper context. I don't want this to be seen as some white guy telling Native Americans what they should be doing and everything. I'm trying to really look at this just from a scientific point of view. My perception, looking at disappearances, just looking at the disappearances of humans. All right. That's what I do. And as everybody knows, I'll talk to anybody. And I have covered Native American disappearances. I've also covered First Nation disappearances in Canada. I think what you brought up before, one of the big issues about why doesn't the broader population of the United States know about this is that our Native American population tends to be very secluded. They're not, in my perception, I don't know what the stats say. They're not
The stats support that.
Yeah, they're not as integrated into the fabric of what we call the country of the United States as much as other minorities are. Not as much as blacks are. My perception, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and I stayed there. I am pretty sure that I would have never run across a Native American person my entire life. Whereas I would run across black people all the time. I would run across Asian people all the time. I would come across Hispanic people all the time. But they're very isolated. So it's maybe a little bit like out of sight, out of mind. In addition, not only do they have their own communities, but these communities tend to be in some of the most isolated parts of the United States. When we talk about Oklahoma and Montana, we're talking about states that are already not that greatly populated. They're not that densely populated. So it's easy for the rest of us to not know what's going on there. And in fact, it's very easy to not pay attention to it. It's very easy to avoid it. Whereas when we look at other minorities in the United States, like blacks, who for the most part tend to live in cities, well, you know what? A lot of white people live in cities too, and a lot of Hispanics live in cities, and a lot of Asians live in cities. And we go to the cities tourists go to the cities. We go to baseball games. We go to the theater. We go on little trips. And so you have this interaction. And so we tend to pay more attention to what goes on in cities because we're intending to go there. Are they violent? Are they not violent? Whereas nobody's paying attention to what goes on in Native American communities because nobody's going there. They don't live in places that, they aren't destination places. I think that when we start talking about why more people don't know about it, I think we need to start there.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really interesting point that I hadn't thought of. That notion of we pay attention to the spaces that we might enter,
That's
like
right.
a cruise ship or Miami or, someplace we might go.
Right.
And those things are going to get more attention than, let's say 100 miles west of Fargo or east of Fargo.
Yes.
And that, Fargo itself might not get that much attention actually. But that kind of drives where our focus goes. And also, an element to that too, to layer on top of that as I think about it, where the media is probably plays a big role in it too. Because
Right.
if you have the combination of we're not paying attention and there aren't news organizations to lift those stories up, how are you going to ever hear about them?
Right. Right. I mean, it's not, in my opinion, as a white person, it is not a racial thing. It's just how we as humans look at our lives. We pay attention to the things that we think are going to intersect with our lives and what the choices that we make. If you're not concerned about, if you're never thinking about ever going to Singapore, you're probably not paying attention on what's going on in Singapore. But if you're planning, I've heard that's a beautiful part of the planet. I'm going to go there. You start reading about it.
Yep.
What goes on there? What can I do? What I can't do? How much do things cost? I think this is a huge part of what we're talking about. Why do not people know, the rest of the American citizens know about it? It's just easy to avoid.
It's so interesting you say that. So, taking your Singapore example, I can think of like 2 points when I was younger where Singapore really became a focus. And, and the 2 points where Singapore became focus was when an American got arrested for uh, spitting out their chewing gum on the ground.
Remember that.
Yeah. And then there was a guy who got punished by an American who got punished by bamboo lashing. And kind of thinking about that in retrospect, it's kind of crazy to me to think that until it happened to an American, I did not know that you could not spit out your chewing gum in Singapore. That's kind of an interesting thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
It suddenly is within your orbit because you're an American citizen. And an American citizen is getting treated like that in some other country. How dare they? And
Right.
then once that was over, everybody went back to forgetting about Singapore.
Correct. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to grab my Blackfeet example for you again and sort of like combine two of these ideas. One of which is that idea that you brought up about law enforcement in general not having experience with long-term missing cases, there not being education and training on it.
Yep.
But then on reservations, you brought up that point about geography, some of the most remote areas.
Yeah.
But you also have on reservations, not all reservations, but a lot of reservations, very large swaths of land with very small populations spread across it. Like the Blackfeet Reservation, which runs, from the Canadian border, pretty far down south along Glacier National Park. It's 1.5 million square acres, and it's got 17,000 people on it, and that includes non-natives. So drop the population down a little bit for just the natives. And it's got 17 police officers, 24/7, 17 police officers. So
Yeah.
resource constraints have to play a role in it, right? Because I imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is a myth that's in my head, but I imagine in a place like New York where you got a lot of resources and you do have institutional history, right, that gets passed on from generation to generation, which doesn't necessarily happen in a smaller police department. Your muscle memory and responding to certain kinds of crime is also going to be better. You're also better resourced and you have technology and but even in a place like New York, even on an important case, there becomes a point where the resources need to get diverted back to, in their minds, back to regular policing. But I think your odds are better. As crazy as Manhattan is, as big as New York City is, your odds are better of finding, a body, a missing person, closing a case. But maybe that's a myth. I don't know.
I don't know what the stats say. Of course, with New York City, the advantage they have is they actually do have a missing person unit. I don't know what that necessarily means as far as how any person within that unit, how knowledgeable they really are about disappearances. But at least there are people waking up in New York City every day and their responsibility is to find missing people. That's better than nothing.
Right.
Whereas for most areas of the United States, you just have general officers working on it. They could be doing a domestic violence intervention today, and they could be doing saving some little ducklings from a sewer tomorrow, and then the day after that, they get a report on a missing persons case. But here's the most important thing. When they show up, whether they're in a missing persons unit or not, that family is going to expect they know something about missing persons. The family doesn't want to hear that, well, I don't have any education, I don't have any experience. They don't want to hear it. If you're the person on that has to fill out the report, you better know what you're talking about. And most of them don't.
So you just sort of fake it. Or there's an incentive to.
Well, what ends up happening is the police, my experience is they just all end up saying all the wrong things. Well, we're going to do everything we can for you. And she's probably just ran away for a couple of days. She'll be back in no time. They have no idea what they're saying. They have, as I've said before, just take the report. Don't be a psychologist. Just take the information. Do not try to set any expectations. You don't know what you're talking about. So don't say anything. This is like anything in life. If you don't know what you're talking about, keep your mouth shut. What did Ben Franklin say? Better for people to think you're an idiot than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Something like that. Just show up. Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, because until you know the indicators and you're able to look at the situation and say to yourself, what are the indicators? Like, understanding things like you brought up Julia Cali, who's a former FBI profiler, like, things like victimology. What were the person's normal patterns? What are the signs that we see when, someone, at a scene, at a house, at whatever, that tell us someone's more likely to there may have been foul play, or it's likely to be a long-term disappearance. If you don't know those things. But I get how it's easy and it's tempting to say those things. But so, circling back to that point about resources, is it fair to say, am I reading this right, that for you, the greatest resource any department could have, including those who are, whether it's the state police or it's a local reservation tribal police, is really the institutional and individual knowledge about disappearances is almost more important.
Money doesn't solve disappearances. That's rewards don't solve disappearances. They just don't. Famous people like Tyler Perry got involved in a couple disappearances here down in Florida, where surely a corrupt cop made an Hispanic guy and a black guy go missing. And Tyler Perry got involved. He put out a bunch of money, reward, nothing. Zero. These guys are still missing. Forget how long ago it was. Was it 20 years ago or something? Money doesn't help. Even when we talk about these scuba companies, they're working for free. Now, granted, they make money off their YouTube channels because they video it and everything else, but they're out there for free with their own equipment. They don't charge the families anything. They're working for free. These things that need to be done can be done for free if you have the knowledge of what you're doing. You're not always going to be right, but when it comes to, resources, whatever that means, the resource is education, and then I don't know how you get into experience without, unfortunately, people going missing, but I think you know what I'm saying here is that the best resource, I'd rather have 10 investigators on the job who are really, really knowledgeable about this. You brought up 17. I'd rather have 17 officers on a reservation that know all about disappearances than 50 who do not.
Yeah, I get exactly what you're saying. And yes, the best experience obviously would be to work a disappearance and work another disappearance and work disappearances. But also having knowledge, having history, being able to kind of like read and see, oh, this is what happened in this similar case. Those
Yep.
things, this all sounds like the beginning of an Ed book.
Well,
It should be written.
listen, I've told you before, don't start giving me work.
Right?
You already have me writing an article for next Monday, all right?
Right,
We'll
right.
do that, okay?
Yeah, I appreciate that too.
You know, it's you can like as all the listeners, at least of my podcast, know, I've never been in law enforcement. Then how is it that I have a track record of being able to predict with over 90% accuracy these disappearances that eventually get resolved? How is that possible? I've never even been in a police car. Then I've never took a criminal justice class. Then
Lucky
how
you
is it
on the
that I
police car.
it can be learned? You know, this stuff can be learned if you take the time to do it. And it'll make everything so much easier. I'll give you a good example because I know we're going to talk about this case. Jermaine Charlo. I read just a very, very general description of what happened on this particular disappearance, in which, you know, she got dropped off. And before I went any further, I was like, the person who dropped her off is the person who caused her disappearance. Now, what did I find out a couple paragraphs later? Oh, it was somebody that she was in a relationship with, and the guy told different stories. I didn't even need to hear any of that. I knew just from she got dropped off and walked down the street enough to know, yeah, that didn't happen.
Right. Right. And what
Whereas
tipped you off?
before, when this originally happened, that the police, oh, well, she went down the street, then we got to go check down the street. No, you don't.
Yeah, no, that is literally what happened.
Yeah. No, you
This is
don't.
literally what happened.
No, you don't. You don't have to do that. This is what I'm talking about. The way I understand it, looking at the list of disappearances that you sent me in preparing for our discussion tonight, what you see is those disappearances are no different than any other type of disappearance that happens anywhere else in the United States, Canada, or anywhere in the world. They're all the same because why? We're all humans. We may look different. We have different ethnicities. We have different backgrounds. We speak different languages. But in the end, when it comes to the 7 deadly sins, if you believe in that type of thing, it's all the same. Ego, pride, vanity, greed, sloth, all of those things. It's all the same. So whether it's out in the middle of Montana or in New York City, people are disappearing for the same reasons. It just may be they're in Montana, they're disappearing at a faster rate or at a greater rate because of things that are going on there. But the disappearances are the same.
Right. Right. And to that point that you're making right there, because of what's going on there, you know, you can look at there in lots of different ways, you know, like the West or, you know, the upper Midwest or on the reservation or around the reservation. But we know based on the demographics, based on data that we have, that there are different intensities to different kinds of challenges. I'm curious whether you can even answer this question. Feel free not to. But is there something you could say? Because we often talk about like the victims themselves, about a community. If you see X, Y, or Z, there's a much greater likelihood of there being long-term disappearances, like whether that's education level or addiction or any other factors. Are there factors that both put individuals and communities at risk?
Well, relationships are the number one cause of disappearances.
Right.
I don't think it doesn't matter on your ethnicity or country or anything else, except for those countries that have governments that actually disappear people. But we're talking about the traditional accepted idea of disappearances of, you know, it might be a murder, it might be a suicide or something like that. But relationships are number one. Now, there are all different types of relationships. It could be a business relationship. That's kind of rare. Most of them have to do with romantic relationships. I know in some of the examples you gave me, you know, a girl was pregnant or something. no matter what society you're in, pregnant women, they're pregnant. And if it was an accident or the guy is a criminal or something, they are at a very high risk of something bad happening to them.
Right.
I don't know what the stats say, but I know that.
Yeah.
These are the things that you have to watch out for. But it's tough. I'm not going to say it's not tough. It is tough because the short-term disappearance, the first few days looks exactly like the long-term disappearance. Um, it's one of those things where I don't have any access to the paperwork that the police do. But I'm sure if I could see it, but they won't give it out because all these things are continuing investigations and we're not giving paperwork out to reporters and everything else. I believe within those reports, you would be able to start seeing the difference between that disappearance that gets solved by itself in 5 days and the one that goes for 25 years.
Right. It's going to be in the first week, maybe the second week of the police file. Well, let me throw out a case for you. The first one I wanted to ask you about was a case out of Nebraska and the Fort Berthold reservation. It's from October 2017. Olivia Longbear. She was a mother. She was 32 years old. The police found text messages eventually that said she was going off-road driving, mudding, and then also before that, she was planning to go to a bonfire. And the police were unable to identify anybody she went mudding with, anyone she went to a bonfire with. Police couldn't find her truck. Eventually, they were able to get sonar equipped, I guess a sonar equipped boat or something along those lines. And they found the truck in a lake near the reservation. Never determined her cause of death. Her body was secured with a seatbelt in the passenger seat of the truck. The truck itself had broken windows to it. And they still, as of today, I was checking with the FBI in Minneapolis, they still have not ruled whether it's a homicide or not, and they're still looking for information in the case. But with what was in that case, that initial part, mom, 32, says she's going to go off-road driving, a bonfire first, and then gone, and her vehicle's gone. What comes to mind to you?
Here's what comes to mind. What I would say is certainly if that's what she said, then obviously an investigator would have an obligation to check those things out. But I would also say if there's anything shady about any of it, like, well, she said she was going to go to this bonfire and then the people were there. If there are enough people there, of course, it was just one person, then you have to start wondering. But if it's a group of people who say, well, she wasn't here, and you discover that, well, can't find anybody that she went mudding with or four-wheeling with or anything, very quickly, I know this, once again, what I'm going to say here is controversial, but the fact is missing people lie. I cannot,
well, of course, just like all of us,
tell you how many disappearances that I've covered where you eventually just have to come to the conclusion that that person was lying. And it doesn't mean they were lying because, well, they said they were going to go there, but really they were going to go see some guy or something. Really, a lot of times it's, I'm lying about this because I'm going to go off and do this by myself. And it might mean do drugs. It might mean commit suicide. People, missing people lie. And so we always have to check that. When their stories don't automatically turn out to be true, you have to default to, I think she was lying for whatever reason. And you can start then looking into that. I read about her case, and as best as I can tell, they just took her words too seriously. They continued to beat on, well, she said it. That's not what you should be doing.
Well, it's an interesting point, too, because in thinking about that, if we were talking about a suspect, for example, the last thing we would do is ever take the words. Like,
Of course.
all right.
But in disappearances, you don't, I never, as I've told my listeners many times, I could have never, as much disappearance reading and watching of YouTube videos and everything before I started Unfound, I could have never guessed how many disappearances that I would cover where people call for rides. Their rides end up there 20 minutes later and the people aren't there.
Thanks for joining Ed and I for this first of 2 episodes on the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. In the next episode, we're going to dive into some specific cases, including those of Olivia Longbear, who went missing near the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, Jermaine Charlo, who went missing from the Flathead Reservation in Montana, the disappearances of Ashley Loring Heavy Runner and Leo Wagner from the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, the disappearance of Jeremy Jordan and Nivea Kingbird at the Leak Lake Reservation in Minnesota, and the broader advice that Ed has for families and law enforcement. If you'd like to join us before the second episode comes out for more discussions with us and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.
I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.